While less well known, the skills of the middle of the javelin tree are actually some of the most powerful tools in the game, with one of them holding the distinction of easily being one of the best, if not the best, boss slaying tools in the entire game. And despite being an entirely melee set of skills, they are essential for the long-term function of the ever-popular lightning Javazon. Starting at the top though, we have, sadly, the least impressive skill of the bunch in the form of Power Strike. Unlike the later skills, this is a fairly simple and unimpressive tool, and you will find that it's often recommended, even if you plan on using the lightning tree, to hold off on investing in this skill, since there are far better skills to use for synergies as you progress. This is because Power Strike is entirely single target, lacks any practical ability to snowball in damage, especially compared to the skills below it, and it's just dealing standard lightning style damage of 1 minimum and then ramping up to maximums. It can get some shiny numbers eventually, but even then it will be completely paling in comparison to pretty much any other skill you can find in the Amazon skill set. So you will, at best, only ever actually use this skill until level 18 at the latest. That's because at level 18, we get the skill I mentioned earlier as being one of, if not the strongest boss killer in the game, and that is Charged Strike, whose raw damage growth per bolt may be a bit slower, and it also suffers from the lightning minimum damage of the other skills, but it more than makes up for both of these by launching an ever-increasing number of those electric bolts, which yes, can all strike the same target at the same time. And in addition to that, while Power Strike relies on actually hitting with your weapon, Charge Strike does not, since whether you hit or miss with the actual spear or javelin, you will launch the unblockable bolts, and a few, if not all, will hit the target in front of you, depending on its size. For larger targets like bosses, you'll almost always get the bolts to hit, while for tiny things like flares, most of the bolts will be hitting the other things around it. Though if you hit with the actual javelin or spear as any consolation, it will add the lightning damage to the attack itself, so it can still do work. And with the slight buff it got in Resurrected by reducing the cost of synergies to it by, well, reducing the number of synergies you need to pump it up, it becomes an even easier to justify investment. All that said, do be careful against enemies that use chilling armor, like players or certain bosses during the Pandemonium events, since you will get smacked in the face for each bolt of the cold armor that gets hit, which can be pretty painful if you're not built for it. And last but not least of these skills is your actual area of effect tool if you're going melee lightning, and that is Lightning Strike, a rather interesting take on the chain lightning formula, ending up with far more bounces than even the sorceress skill itself, since this gains a bounce for every skill level while the sorceress skill only gains one every 5. And while this doesn't have a mastery backing it, it does have some decent synergies, and this higher count of bounces makes it a much better option at dealing with swarms of enemies than its cousin, especially considering it has a flat mana cost of 9 compared to the double digits of chain lightning. Just like with Charge Bolt, you don't have to hit for this effect to take place, though if you do, the actual hit does get the added lightning damage as well, and just like the other skills, it benefits just fine from % skill damage and minus enemy resist, making this and Charge Strike exceptional skills to use with the updated Infinity for Resurrected, that allows it in spears rather than just polearms. And as far as how the lightning bouncing actually works, there's some rules to keep in mind. What you see on screen is not necessarily what is actually happening in the actual server. The bolt itself will bounce between available targets within a medium radius of each hit, and it can bounce back to hit previous targets as long as the next delay has expired, which, if you're curious, the next delay is 4 frames or just over 1/6 of a second, so that's the gap between whenever you can hit them. So you can get some pretty fun stuff going on, and even the strategy of bouncing it off of a couple lightning immunes to clear out the non-immunes being extremely viable with it, since this will allow it to maintain the chain much longer than otherwise due to guaranteeing a couple of valid targets to hit without leaving like 1 or 2 stragglers behind. Overall, while Lightning Fury catches most of the glory, and we'll cover why that is next time, the strike skills have a lot more power than they're given credit for, though thankfully many of the more in-tune guides do acknowledge it rather than relying solely on the flash and flare of screens full of lightning that sadly don't do as well against bosses. So, do you use the melee lightning skills very often, or do you prefer keeping the combat at a range? Mention it down below, and check out the video on screen for more creative solutions to the problems of hell, and as always, a special thanks to the channel members and patrons that help keep the lights on.